The banquet hall was filled with soft golden light, crystal chandeliers casting reflections across polished floors and white-covered tables. Conversations floated quietly in the air, respectful and restrained, as uniforms and dark suits blended into a formal mosaic of rank, history, and ceremony. This was not just another dinner. It was a commemorative gathering meant to honor service and legacy. Among the guests were active duty officers, retired commanders, politicians, and a few elderly veterans whose presence alone commanded silent respect. One of them sat near the center of the room, his posture slightly stooped but dignified, hands resting calmly on the table as if they had learned patience long before the world demanded it. His face bore the marks of age, not weakness, lines etched deep by years of responsibility, loss, and discipline. He spoke little, listened much, and observed everything. Across the room, Colonel James Matthews moved with confidence that came from years of command. His uniform was immaculate, ribbons aligned with precision, medals catching the light as he walked. Matthews was known for his sharp wit, commanding presence, and a reputation for being both brilliant and intimidating. He had led men in combat, briefed generals, and earned respect through performance rather than politeness. Tonight, however, he felt relaxed, even amused. The atmosphere, the wine, the applause earlier in the evening had softened his edge. He scanned the room, recognizing faces, exchanging nods, enjoying the unspoken hierarchy that gatherings like this always revealed. When his eyes landed on the elderly man seated quietly near the center, something stirred his curiosity. The man wore a simple dark suit, no visible decorations, no medals pinned to his chest. Just a small, almost unnoticeable pin on his lapel. Matthews frowned slightly. At events like these, everyone had a story, and most wore it proudly. This man seemed out of place, not because he didn't belong, but because he did not advertise why he did. Matthews leaned toward another officer and murmured a question, but the officer only shrugged. No one seemed to know much about the old man, only that he had been invited personally and that his name appeared without rank on the seating chart. Curiosity turned into a quiet challenge in Matthews' mind. He had spent his career reading people, measuring confidence, testing reactions. He stood, straightened his jacket, and walked toward the table. Conversations nearby faded as some noticed the colonel's approach. Matthews stopped beside the elderly man, who looked up slowly, his eyes sharp despite their age. There was no surprise in them, no anxiety, only calm recognition of another presence. "Good evening, sir," Matthews said, his tone polite but firm. "I don't believe we've met." The old man nodded. "Good evening." His voice was steady, low, and unhurried. Matthews glanced briefly at the empty space on the man's jacket, where medals often rested. "May I ask," he continued, with a faint smile forming, "what rank you held when you served?" There was no malice in the words, but there was an edge, a subtle testing note that seasoned officers often used without realizing it. Around them, a few nearby guests paused, sensing an exchange worth watching. The elderly man did not answer immediately. He looked down at his hands for a moment, as if considering whether the question deserved a response at all. When he looked back up, his expression had not changed. "I didn't really have a rank that fits neatly into categories," he said. Matthews chuckled lightly. "Everyone had a rank, sir. Even the most unconventional assignments answer to something." The old man's lips curved into the faintest smile, not of humor, but of memory. "I suppose that's true." Encouraged, Matthews leaned slightly closer. "So what should I call you? Captain? Major? Colonel?" The old man met his gaze directly now. The room seemed quieter, as if even the chandeliers were listening. "You can call me whatever makes you comfortable," he replied. A few soft laughs rippled from nearby tables. Matthews smiled wider, interpreting the response as playful deflection. "Fair enough," he said. "But I am curious. After all, this evening is about stories. Surely you have one." The old man inhaled slowly, then spoke in a voice that carried just far enough to be heard by those closest. I was operational. For most of my career, names and ranks were inconveniences. Matthews raised an eyebrow. Special operations? Yes, which unit? Matthews asked, now genuinely interested. The old man paused again, longer this time. When he spoke, his voice dropped slightly, not in secrecy, but in weight. Delta Force, actual. The words landed without volume, without drama, but with impact. Matthew's smile froze, then faded. His posture stiffened, as if instinctively coming to attention without meaning to. A silence spread outward, thick and unmistakable. One officer at a nearby table stopped mid-sip. Another shifted uncomfortably in his chair. The casual tone of the evening cracked, replaced by something older, heavier. Matthews stared at the man, searching for signs of exaggeration, irony, anything that would make the statement less absolute. He found none. The old man's eyes were steady, unblinking, and entirely uninterested in impressing anyone. They were the eyes of someone who had nothing left to prove. That's quite a claim, Matthews said finally, his voice lower now, cautious. The old man nodded once. I'm aware. Matthews straightened fully, the playful energy gone. He glanced around, aware that attention had quietly focused on them. When did you serve? Long enough ago that most records won't have my name, the old man replied. And recent enough that some people here trained under people I trained. That was when Matthews felt it, a subtle but undeniable shift in his own confidence. He had commanded battalions, but he had also studied history, doctrine, and the quiet legends spoken of in training halls and classified briefings. Delta Force was not something one claimed lightly. Those who truly belonged to it rarely spoke of it at all. I didn't mean any disrespect, Matthews said, the words coming more carefully now. I know, the old man replied. Disrespect usually sounds different. Matthews exhaled, realizing only then that he had been holding his breath. May I ask your name? The old man hesitated, then gave a simple answer. Daniel, just Daniel? Yes. A senior officer nearby cleared his throat. Colonel, he said quietly to Matthews, if I may. Matthews turned. The officer's face was pale, his eyes wide. I believe I recognize him. From a briefing years ago. No photos. No rank listed. Matthews looked back at Daniel, and something close to awe crept into his expression. Then I owe you an apology, he said. Daniel shook his head gently. No, you owe your men honesty and yourself humility. Apologies are unnecessary. The colonel nodded, slowly. He felt smaller than he had moments before, not diminished, but recalibrated. The hierarchy he had relied on all his life had just revealed a deeper layer, one that existed beyond titles and ceremonies. Around them, the room resumed its quiet murmur, but the energy had changed. Word traveled fast in places like this. Even without words. Daniel turned his gaze back to the table, signaling the end of the exchange. Matthews stood there a moment longer, then brought his hand up in a crisp, respectful salute, one given not out of protocol, but recognition. Daniel did not return it. He simply inclined his head slightly, accepting the gesture without ceremony. As Matthews walked back to his seat, the weight of the encounter followed him. He replayed the moment again and again, realizing how close he had come to making a joke out of something sacred, something earned through sacrifice he could barely imagine. He understood now that the most dangerous men were often the quietest, and the greatest stories were carried by those least interested in telling them. Daniel sat silently, hands folded once more, listening to the sounds of the hall. He had seen this before, many times, in many forms. Curiosity, disbelief, recognition. It always followed the same pattern. He felt no pride in it, only a distant sadness for the years and faces that memory refused to release. Tonight was just another reminder that while time moved forward, some experiences never truly ended. The chandeliers continued to glow. The banquet continued, and the world went on. Unaware that history had just spoken in a quiet voice, and only a few had truly listened. The remainder of the evening unfolded with a strange duality, the banquet continuing as planned while an invisible current moved beneath the surface. Conversations resumed, laughter returned in measured doses, but for those who had witnessed the exchange, something fundamental had shifted. Colonel Matthews sat at his table, nodding when spoken to, responding when required, yet his attention kept drifting back to the elderly man seated across the room. Daniel had returned to stillness, appearing once again like a quiet guest among many, yet Matthews now understood that stillness was not emptiness. It was containment. Matthews replayed every word, every tone, every expression. He prided himself on leadership, on knowing when to push and when to listen. Yet tonight, he had misread silence as absence and modesty as insignificance. The realization unsettled him. In training, they taught that arrogance was more dangerous than fear, that underestimating the unknown had ended more missions than enemy fire. He wondered how many times he had walked past men like Daniel without ever knowing it. At another table, a retired general leaned toward a former intelligence officer, his voice barely audible. "That's him," he said. "I saw a declassified briefing years ago. No details, just outcomes." The intelligence officer nodded slowly. "The ones they never decorate publicly. Because decoration requires a story," the general replied. "And some stories can't exist." Daniel felt the subtle attention like a change in temperature. He did not turn, did not acknowledge it. He had learned long ago that recognition was a liability. Even now, decades removed from operations, habits remained. Sit where exits are visible. Listen more than speak. Never assume safety simply because time has passed. A young Marine seated behind Matthews whispered to another, curiosity overtaking restraint. "Did you hear what he said?" "I heard," the other replied. "But that can't be real." Their commanding officer shot them a warning glance, silencing them instantly. Daniel's mind drifted, not to the present, but to fragments of the past that surfaced uninvited. Dust filled air. Radios hissing with coded language. Faces seen once and never again. He remembered the weight of responsibility more than the danger. The knowledge that failure meant consequences far beyond himself. There were no parades for those moments, no applause. Only the quiet understanding that something terrible had been prevented, or something necessary had been done. A server approached his table cautiously. "Sir, would you like anything else?" Daniel looked up, offered a polite smile. "Water is fine." "Thank you." The server nodded, visibly relieved, and moved away. Across the room, Matthews finally stood again. This time, there was no confidence in his stride, only purpose. He approached Daniel more slowly, stopping at a respectful distance. "Sir," he said softly, "may I sit for a moment?" Daniel studied him, then gestured to the empty chair beside him. "If you like." Matthews sat, his posture formal but his tone subdued. "I've been thinking about what you said." Daniel nodded. "I've spent my career teaching men about leadership, courage, sacrifice," Matthews continued. "Tonight made me realize how little I truly understand about the highest level of service." Daniel did not respond immediately. When he did, his words were measured. "Understanding comes with cost. Be careful what you seek." Matthews swallowed. "Did you ever regret it?" Daniel's eyes drifted forward, unfocused, seeing something beyond the room. "Regret implies choice. We did what needed to be done with the information we had at the time." "That doesn't answer the question," Matthews said quietly. Daniel looked at him again. "Then yes." "And no." Matthews nodded, accepting that was all he would get. "People like you," he said after a pause, "you're legends to us. Stories passed down, half whispered." Daniel's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. Legends are dangerous. They turn people into symbols instead of humans. The words struck Matthews harder than any rebuke. He thought of the men under his command, how easily he had simplified their experiences into speeches and slogans. He realized that heroism was often a label placed by those farthest from the consequences. "Why are you here tonight?" Matthews asked. Daniel considered the question. An old friend insisted. Said it was time I remembered the world still moves. And does it? Daniel allowed himself a faint smile. It always does. Whether we're ready or not. A bell chimed softly, signaling the next portion of the program. Guests began returning to their seats. Matthews stood. "Thank you," he said. "For your time. And for everything else." Daniel inclined his head. "Take care of your people." "I will," Matthews replied, and meant it more deeply than ever before. As the evening progressed, a speaker took the stage, delivering a polished speech about honor, tradition, and sacrifice. Applause followed at the appropriate moments. Standing ovations offered where expected. Daniel listened politely, but the words washed over him like echoes of things long resolved. He had heard variations of the same speech for decades. They were not wrong, just incomplete. Toward the end of the night, awards were presented. Names were called, medals pinned, photographs taken. Daniel remained seated, clapping softly when appropriate. No one called his name. No one ever had. That was how it was meant to be. Matthews watched from across the room as Daniel stood slowly when the audience was asked to rise in recognition of veterans present. The old man stood among many, indistinguishable to most. Yet Matthews felt a lump in his throat. He realized that while the room honored service in general, it could never truly honor the depth of what some individuals had carried. Alone, when the final applause faded and guests began to disperse, Matthews noticed Daniel moving toward the exit. Without thinking, he followed. They walked side by side for a moment in silence. Outside, the night air was cool, the city lights distant and indifferent. "Will you be staying long?" Matthews asked. "No," Daniel replied. "I've stayed long enough." Matthews hesitated. "If there's ever anything," Daniel raised a hand gently, "the best thing you can do is remember what tonight taught you. Nothing more." A car waited at the curb, unremarkable, blending into the line of vehicles. Daniel stopped, turned to Matthews. "You're a good officer," he said. "Just don't confuse authority with understanding." Matthews nodded, unable to speak. Daniel entered the car, the door closing softly. Moments later, it pulled away, disappearing into traffic. No escort, no recognition. Just another old man leaving at Matthews stood there long after, the weight of the encounter settling into something permanent. He knew that this night would follow him for the rest of his career, reshaping how he spoke, how he listened, how he judged silence. He had gone pale not from fear, but from the sudden clarity that true power often exists far beyond visibility. Inside the hall, staff cleared tables, lights dimmed, and the evening officially ended. But for Matthews, and for a few others who had truly understood what they witnessed, the lesson had only just begun. The days that followed passed quietly, yet for Colonel Matthews the world felt subtly altered, as if a lens had been adjusted and reality now carried sharper edges. He returned to his duties with the same discipline, the same precision, but his awareness had deepened. In meetings he listened longer. In briefings he questioned assumptions he once accepted without thought. He found himself watching the quiet ones more closely. Those who spoke little yet carried themselves with an economy of motion that hinted at experience beyond their files. Daniel, meanwhile, returned to a life that left few traces. His home was modest, orderly, filled with books whose spines revealed more history than decoration. He rose early, as he always had, and took long walks before the city fully woke. People passed him without notice, seeing only an elderly man moving carefully through the morning air. He preferred it that way. Anonymity was not loneliness to him. It was freedom earned through decades of restraint. One afternoon, a letter arrived addressed simply to Daniel, the handwriting neat and deliberate. He recognized it immediately. Inside, Matthews wrote with careful honesty, not praise, not apology, but reflection. He spoke of his men, of changes he was making in how he led, of the reminder that the measure of service could not be captured by rank alone. He thanked Daniel not for what he had done in the past, but for what he had shown in a single quiet evening. Daniel read the letter once, then placed it in a drawer with others like it, each representing a moment when the past brushed against the present and left something worthwhile behind. Weeks later, Matthews found himself briefing a group of young officers. He spoke less about doctrine and more about judgment. He told them that confidence must be balanced by humility, that curiosity should never turn into challenge, and that silence was not absence. He did not mention Daniel by name, nor Delta Force, nor the banquet hall. He did not need to. The lesson was larger than the story. Among those officers was a lieutenant who listened intently, sensing that the colonel was teaching something not found in manuals. Later, that lieutenant would pass the lesson on in his own words, and then another would do the same. The truth would travel quietly, as it always had. Daniel's health began to decline gently, without drama. He noticed it first in small ways, a step taken slower than before, a moment of fatigue where there had been none. He accepted it without resentment. He had lived longer than many he remembered, and with that came responsibility to carry their stories with care. On some evenings he sat by the window and allowed memory to surface, not the noise of conflict, but the faces of teammates, the shared understanding that needed no words. He did not dwell on loss. He honored it by living well. One morning, as he walked through a nearby park, a young man jogging past slowed, then stopped. He turned back, studying Daniel's posture, the alertness that age had not erased. "Sir," the young man said, slightly out of breath, "were you in the military?" Daniel smiled faintly. "A long time ago." The young man nodded, satisfied somehow. "Thank you." Daniel inclined his head, and the young man ran on, carrying with him a feeling he could not quite name. At headquarters, Matthews received news of a successful operation carried out by a unit he had helped shape. The report was efficient, understated, focused on outcomes rather than heroics. He approved it with a quiet sense of pride, recognizing in its tone the values he now held more firmly. He wondered briefly what Daniel would think, then realized he already knew the answer. Outcomes mattered. Noise did not. Months passed. The memory of the banquet faded for most, replaced by new events, new priorities. For Matthews, it remained a reference point, a private recalibration. For Daniel, it became one of the last times the past announced itself so clearly in the present. He did not seek more moments like it. One was enough. When winter came, Daniel's walks grew shorter. He spent more time reading, writing brief notes to people he trusted, organizing things so that nothing would burden anyone later. He did not fear the end. He had made peace with it long ago, somewhere between missions when the margin between living and dying had been measured in seconds. On a quiet morning, Daniel did not rise. The passing was gentle, unremarkable, as he would have wanted. There was no announcement, no ceremony planned beyond the simplest arrangements. A small group gathered, people whose lives had intersected with his in different ways, some knowing more than others, none needing explanations. There were no medals displayed, no speeches about valor. Just silence, respect, and gratitude. Matthews learned of it through a brief message delivered without embellishment. He stood alone in his office for a long time afterward, then closed the door and allowed himself a moment of reflection. He thought of the calm voice, the steady eyes, the lesson delivered without instruction. He realized that some teachers never know the full reach of what they impart. Years later, Matthews would retire. At his own farewell gathering, he declined elaborate praise. In his final remarks, he spoke of the unseen, of those whose service could not be summarized, of the importance of listening before judging. Some in the audience understood. Others would, in time, somewhere. A young officer would recall a story about a colonel who once went pale at a dinner and would wonder why. Somewhere else, an old letter would be read again and a lesson reinforced. The world would continue, imperfect and demanding, shaped quietly by moments of humility and recognition. The story would never be written in official histories. It did not need to be. Its impact lived in changed perspectives, in quieter leadership, in the understanding that the greatest truths often arrive without fanfare, and that sometimes the most powerful words a person can speak are the ones that need no explanation at all.